States, Donald John Trump.
By all counts, this was an improbable victory for Donald Trump, having trailed his Democratic opponent Hillary Clinton in every possible opinion poll leading to the voting day. But Donald Trump's shrill campaign of making America great again found a surprisingly resounding support from Americans. There were clearly misgivings about his style of performance, questions were being asked about his vision and commitment, and last but surely not the least, history of his maverick behavior was high on the list of concerns, not just for Americans, but indeed the rest of the world. Six months is surely not a significant time period to judge the performance of a president, much less that of the US president. But so much has happened in these 6 months that it definitely sounds like a good idea to look back at the 6 months of Trump presidency. In these 6 months, Trump cozied up to Russia, then went ballistic against the country. Whether Russia meddled in the US elections is a question that will probably never be answered with any conviction. Trump's approval ratings fell to levels unheard of in a US presidency. No significant legislation happened in these 6 months. His own travel ban from select Muslim countries was overturned by the courts. Obamacare still hasn't been repealed. In the meanwhile, key personnel in his own team came in and went out. One word describes Donald Trump's 6 months in office: confusion.
Well, it's been catastrophic, historically bad. There is focus on the policies that have changed or have not changed, and those are important. But more important than that is the strategic shifts that he has actually initiated or that are occurring because of him internationally and domestically with regard to the rule of law and the functioning of our democracy. So there is, I think, almost literally nothing good and only bad to say about what has happened since his election.
A good place to start reviewing Trump's 6 months in office is his foreign policy. Flip-flops have been central to how he dealt with foreign affairs. The best, of course, was Russia. Throughout his campaign, his admiration for Russian President Vladimir Putin was there for all to see. But since taking office, there began a series of flip-flops that went from swearing about his relations with Russia to virtually swearing at Russia, thanks to the classic whodunit. Did Russia meddle in the US elections or didn't they? Ironically for Trump, he drew flack for wanting to normalize the very relationship that his predecessor Barack Obama and his own 2016 presidential rival Hillary Clinton sought to reset. In 2009, Clinton had famously held a symbolic red button along with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, indicating Washington's and Moscow's attempts to reset their ties. The deep divisions between the Trump administration and the American deep state are now apparent, with Trump being compelled by the Beltway politics to adopt a harder line against Putin and the Kremlin alike.
This presidency has been unprecedented and in a very negative way in terms of a real threat to our democracy and rule of law. That may sound like hyperbole. Let me assure you it's not, because President Trump, unfortunately, has attacked our democratic institutions and our legal institutions. A free press by constantly calling it purveyors of fake news, false news, and lies. Our judiciary by questioning its authority. Our quasi-independent Department of Justice, which is supposed to operate with some autonomy with respect to the president, by trying to control it in all sorts of ways. And most of all, and most immediately, by trying to crush or quash an independent, legitimate investigation of Russian interference with our elections last year. an investigation that's based on verified intelligence sources indicating that they tried to hack into our election systems, release emails and the like. And Trump has denied that that's taken place, even though some of his own officials have acknowledged it's taken place, and even though almost all leading Republicans and Democrats have. He's tried to quash that investigation because it could lead back to him. And what's more, he's done nothing to really look into ways of preventing Russian interference with our elections in the future, and that's even more worrisome.
One, there's been a very, very large turnover of advisors that he's had. He seems to have a congenital inability to listen to good advice. He seems to think that he knows everything. He seems to lack the ability to discern between truth and what is maybe not entirely true, as you can see in recent times. And I don't think basically that he has the attention span to listen, because these are very, very big, important issues which have a historical background, especially the relationship between Russia and the US. And I don't think he really understands foreign policy at all, or what are the subtle nuances of diplomacy. And I think he's just like a kid who gets up and says whatever he wants to say.
On the issue of North Korea, Trump's bluster and bravado clearly didn't wash with Pyongyang, which continued to cock a snook at the US. With its repeated ICBM tests, North Korea has amply demonstrated its capabilities of hitting California and beyond with a ballistic missile. In response, Trump signed a legislation that will impose more sanctions on North Korea. When asked how he was planning to defuse the growing tensions between the two countries, he wanted China to exert more pressure on North Korea to make it fall in line. Amid reports that the Trump administration is pushing for regime change in Pyongyang, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson clarified that this was not the case.
And we're trying to convey to the North Koreans, we are not your enemy, we're not your threat, but you are presenting an unacceptable threat to us, and we have to respond. And we hope that at some point they will begin to understand that, and that we would like to sit and have a dialogue with them about the future that will give them the security they seek and the future economic prosperity for North Korea, but that will then promote economic prosperity throughout Northeast Asia.
But clearly, there is confusion in Team Trump on how to handle North Korea. Not too long ago, CIA Director Mike Pompeo had suggested a more belligerent approach against North Korea, hinting that the North Koreans would probably want Kim Jong-un to go.
North Korea is probably the hardest problem for foreign policy experts or in the foreign policy arena to address. China does not have the same objectives as the United States. It is true, China has the most leverage, but China also has constraints. China's objectives are to keep America from extending its influence north of the 38th parallel into North Korea, to keep North Korea from collapsing, and to keep 25 million Korean refugees from becoming a burden to China. It also probably sees a nuclear North Korea, although as a problem, yet another complication for America to keep America distant from China's and South Asia's shores. So their objectives are different. So it's simply naive to imagine on the part of Trump that by asking and then demanding and then somehow trying to pressure the largest country in the world to expect China to change its policies to do what America wants. The problem is one without a solution, really.
Trump's Syria policy is no better. Years before he became the American president, Donald Trump had tweeted this, saying, quote, "If the US attacks Syria and hits the wrong targets, killing civilians, there will be worldwide hell to pay. Stay away and fix broken US," unquote. But after taking over as president, Trump hasn't held himself back while bombing Syria without necessary precautions to protect innocent civilians. While the US policy has always revolved around removing Syrian President Bashar al-Assad from power, the Trump administration felt otherwise.
You pick and choose your battles when we're looking at this. It's about changing our priorities, and our priority is no longer to sit there and focus on getting Assad out.
Trump's Syria policy has queered the pitch for his relations with Russia. Responding to the downing of a Syrian jet, Russia threatened to target American fighter jets, which prompted Australia to briefly suspend its operations.
He did the one thing which was good, and that is react to the use of chemical weapons. But then he's backed off on that, and now he evidently is taking away support for those who have opposed Assad, the democratic forces within Syria. So I don't think we really have much to show for his leadership in regard to Syria. I do think that the United States, working with others, have been able to make progress against ISIS. I do think that the anti-terrorism focus of the Trump administration is a good one, and is one in which the United States and India can work together very well.
His policy was, let's work with Russia in fighting the Islamic State and Syrian rebel groups in Syria. He didn't seem to be overly concerned that Syria and the Assad government, which has a very bad human rights record, working with them was not an issue for him. But his administration in policy implementation has moved in the other direction, that yes, we agree on fighting the Islamic State, but we don't agree on fighting alongside Russia or with the Assad government. So what has happened on the ground is that American troops and American officials are supporting a third group of rebels who are effectively non-Islamic State, but not Al-Qaeda, which is another set of rebels there, with some limited success. But it has resulted in, again, America having a bizarre policy in which the president says one thing, but his administration does something else on the ground.
Elsewhere, Trump continued to take more decisions that were clearly unpopular. He went back on everything promised by his predecessor, Barack Obama. Trump not only pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, but also the Clean Power Plan. He ordered his administration to take a fresh look at ongoing efforts to reduce carbon emissions. And as in almost all departments, Trump's Environment Protection Agency too is headed by a yes man, Scott Pruitt, a man given to fudging existing statistics. President Trump claims to be totally in favor of the wonderful European Union, but he hoped the UK would pull out of Brexit, and London came good. As for the EU itself, he says it is merely a vehicle for Germany, and that's why he thought the UK was so smart in getting out. In Afghanistan, ignoring calls for a modest troop increase from his own forces stationed there, he decided to first explore what his country had been doing in Afghanistan for the last 17 years in the first place. Clearly frustrated with a losing war in Afghanistan, Trump is considering replacing Army General John Nicholson, the current top US commander of coalition forces in the country, according to some reports. Even on Pakistan, he has done little of consequence save his trademark bluster and big talk. Despite repeatedly being proven a haven for terrorists, the US has stopped short of calling Pakistan a terrorist state, though there were demands from even within his own party. Ted Poe, a Republican, had recently spoken to WION on his demand to label Pakistan a terrorist state.
Well, there's two different issues. In the defense reauthorization bill, we cut aid to Pakistan, and in that legislation, not completely, but we cut aid. That was just an amendment to the bigger bill. My legislation is independent and separate from that defense reauthorization bill, and my bill does two things. It labels Pakistan as a state sponsor of terrorism, and then a second bill determines that they should be removed from the NATO ally status.
On the Israel-Palestine standoff, Donald Trump, unlike his predecessors, seems surprisingly devoid of tact and intuition. He bombastically announced his desire to make the ultimate deal between the Palestinians and Israelis during his first ever 8-day foreign trip, losing no opportunity to criticize steps taken by his predecessor Barack Obama. Some Trump aides also announced with much bluster that the US embassy will be shifted from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, but the flight back home to Washington seems to have sobered Trump down. That has never been mentioned again. Finally, and as for the US's traditional bogeyman Iran, Trump is playing a double game. He has slammed new sanctions on Iran, but the nuclear deal with the country still holds good. How long it will take for another Trump flip-flop, only time will tell. Clearly, Trump does not have too many friends internationally, not even Russia. But the whispers about Trump not acting on his own, but on the directions of what is called the deep state, refuse to go away. Looking at his flip-flops, could this be just about a man who is inconsistent, or is there a design in that inconsistency?
There's no deep state running things over here. In fact, one of the great strengths of the U.S. system is the checks and balances, both in the Congress and in the courts, and indeed among the professionals who are charged with the day-to-day operation of our foreign policy.
If his foreign policy has tied up in knots, Trump's 6-month-old presidency hasn't earned too many fans within the country as well. The Washington Post ABC News poll, which put Trump's 6-month approval rating at a historic 70-year low at 36%, down 6% from his ratings at the 100-day mark not too long ago. When it comes to the American economy, Trump has promised to keep jobs in the US with the Make America Great Again slogan. But for many IT companies which rely on outsourcing, a lot of uncertainty has loomed when it comes to hiring international workers. Students are also on edge about visa cuts on how this will impact their higher education. Immigrants have noticed more backlash when it comes to racial attacks with the killing of Indian-American Srinivas Kochibhotla earlier this year. Trump has also pushed for a travel ban on many Muslim-majority countries that has not settled well with Americans. The problem with Trump is he knows what he does not want, but has been hopeless in articulating what he wants, and more importantly, how he wants to implement it. He so badly wants to repeal Obamacare, but despite his best efforts, he's not been able to. The reason? He has no viable alternatives in place. A majority of Americans are clearly upset with the way he has handled the alleged Russian meddling in the US elections. The question whether the Russians did or did not still remains to be answered. His idea of the Mexican wall might sound fascinating to some, but Trump clearly has no answers to who will bear the costs and where will it come from. His party has majority in both the houses, but he has not been able to push through any idea of his, primarily because he's unclear on how these ideas would be implemented. And as he happily indulges in more controversial decisions, the public mood against him turns stronger, louder, and shriller. Trump's latest move not to allow transgenders in the army has made him more unpopular than ever before.
Trump, as you know, came in with a set of promises, a lot of them which were nationalistic, anti-immigrant, protectionist in terms of trade sentiment. What has been good is that a lot of his agenda has actually not happened. There actually has been very little, that he has passed absolutely no legislation, for example, since he's come to office. A lot of the executive orders that he passed in an attempt to enforce those rules have been overturned by courts or have only been partially implemented. So yes, there's been a tightening of immigration. There's actually been no shift on trade policy other than the repeal, the decision not to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And a lot of these other areas he hasn't actually done very much other than speak aggressively.
His indecisive and tentative approach has reflected in the team that he picked too. In recent times, members in Team Trump have been through a constant revolving door, coming in and leaving within not much time. Anthony Scaramucci, Director of Communications at the White House, gone in 10 days. Sally Yates, Acting Attorney General, gone in 11 days. Michael Flynn, National Security Advisor, 23 days. Katie Walsh, Deputy Chief of Staff in the White House, gone in 70 days. Mike Dubke, Communications Director, 86 days. Angela Reid, White House Usher, out in 106 days. James Comey, FBI Director, sacked in 110 days. Katie McFarland, Deputy National Security Advisor, out in 118 days. Sean Spicer, White House spokesperson, lasted 183 days. Michael Schott, Deputy Press Secretary, gone in 187 days. And Reince Priebus, Chief of Staff, out in 189 days. If Donald Trump has made one effective point in his presidency so far, it is that he trusts his family more than anyone else. Nepotism is probably a first in US presidency, but Trump could not care less. And so his daughter Ivanka is the advisor to the president, and his son-in-law Jared Kushner is the senior advisor to the president in charge of brokering peace in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And so the Trump presidency bungles along. There have been occasional whispers of impeachment, but at the moment they are far-fetched. In the end, let us leave you with some enduring images of 6 months of the Donald Trump presidency.
Go ahead.